Hi, Kirk Degiorgio here, back for Sonic Academy, and I'm here to introduce a short video on 3D mixing. Sounds a bit pretentious, but no, sound can be left to right, and you use panning to adjust that, and some other EQ tricks which I'm going to show you, and also front to back, and we can use some reverb and more EQ tricks to enhance our sense of forward and rear sounds. And don't forget top to bottom. So there's our 3 dimensions. But also we're going to explore some techniques and plugins that allow you to create movement within your 3D spaces. So it's a short video, this one, but hopefully it will help you get your mixes having a bit more width and depth. This is Kirk Degiorgio for Sonic Academy. This is 3D mixing. Mixing in 3D. First of all, we are not talking about surround sound here. We are talking about mixing in 3D in stereo, using things from nature, biomimicry, having a look at the way our ears hear sounds in the natural world and applying those techniques to your DAW. Yes, it sounds pretentious, but it really does work. What we're going to do in this brief tutorial is just choose a very mono, boring, flat, in-your-face sound like this. So enough of that, and we are going to move it around 3 dimensions, left to right, front to back, and top to bottom. Pretty cool, huh? You can use these techniques to maybe enhance a breakdown, or maybe you want to do an interesting intro, and you can also apply the same theory to entire mixes. So basically what I want you to do first of all is picture in your mind an inverted pyramid. So the pointy bit of the pyramid is at the bottom, the widest part at the top. If you can imagine at the bottom, that's all your low frequency content. At the top is your highest frequency content. And as I said, you can apply this theory to an entire mix. So if you're mixing drums, you would have the kick drum right at the bottom. It would be centered at that point, and it would be mostly low frequency material. Then perhaps slightly going up the pyramid a little bit, and maybe slightly off center to not totally clash with the kick, you would have your snare, which takes up a lot of lower mid-range and mid-range, and also some upper mids, but mostly in that kind of area that sits above the kick, if you can imagine this vertical way of thinking about frequencies. Then you would have in the middle somewhere, you would have your toms, plenty of wide frequency content there, and you can pan those a bit wider, and then you would have a hi-hat with a very sharp hard transient, and that would be somewhere near the top frequency wise, but you would place that quite central because it has a very distinctive transient. We're going to have some transient relevant content in this tutorial. And of course you would have your cymbals, maybe you'd have your overheads panned hard left and right at the top of that frequency range. Okay, so if you can just picture that upside down pyramid in your mind, it would really help you grasp what I'm trying to explain. Now, different mix engineers have different ways to create this sense of illusion of moving from back to front. Certainly left to right is pretty straightforward. You have your panner, of course, here in Ableton. It says C for center, so of course we had our upfront sound completely centered. But if you want to move things around, that's where things get interesting. And if we move to our 3D version of this arpeggio, the first part of my audio chain is a simple auto panner, which is stock from Ableton's plugins. So very simply, you can hear it slowly moving from left to right. You can increase the rate, of course, get almost up to audio rate effects. You can change the shape, you can have it moving about randomly, but I've got it on a nice kind of slow sine wave. Okay, so that's the easiest way to move things around, basically from left to right. But now we've got the rest of this effects chain, and you heard the effect. It's quite dramatic the way it moves things from front to back and from top to bottom. So let's go through this effect rack bit by bit. First of all, I've created an effects rack to put all of the effects in. The effects include a EQ from Eventide, which I'll explain why I use that in a moment. Then we've got Ableton's reverb plugin set to a large factory preset just to exaggerate this effect for this tutorial. And then we've got a utility plugin, and that is to put the signal through mid-side processing, and we're going to explain how we move from middle to side later on. All this is controlled by one single LFO. Now, the LFO is a modulator within Ableton, and I've mapped it to a macro. You can map this LFO to 8 different parameters all at once, but I'll explain why I've had to map it to one macro in a bit. But let's open Split EQ, and it's easier to see what's going on. So here, the LFO is moving this low frequency, which is a high pass filter. And you'll see now why I use the macro, because if we open up the macro settings, I want this single LFO to control various parameters simultaneously, but some of them I want to move in an opposing direction to the others. So you have to kind of invert the minimum and maximum settings. Now, I've used split EQ rather than a general EQ because I think it's a more natural way of mimicking the way we perceive sound moving from front to behind us. That is because split EQ splits our signal into two. You have the transient content and the tonal content. The transient content is in green, the tonal content is in blue. When we hear a sound in nature, the transient usually sounds right close up, and then the tonal material, the reverberation or the resonance as it were, follows on behind that transient. So if you want something really in your face, direct, right in front of the mix, you can think of a snare drum. You know, if you whack a snare drum, it's that initial hit that will hit you right in the face, and then the resonance, the tone comes afterwards and isn't so full on. So as you can visualize here, as the LFO modulates these parameters here, which is the transient in green and the tonal in blue, it's a high pass filter, you can see that as we get rid of some of the low frequency content, the transient gets reduced much more than the tonal. So you have an element of the frequency range of the tonal part of the sound still left in, and I think it creates a more realistic effect rather than just using a normal EQ. Okay, that is done by opening the macro mapping and simply lowering the maximum amount that the tonal control is affected compared to the transient control. Right, let's move on to the next plugin. This is Ableton's Reverb, which is the large factory, and the macro here is affecting the amount of dry and wet signal. Now you'll see here, this is where the holistic approach to all 3 dimensions comes into play, because we have the same macro controlling the dry wet as all controlled from this LFO, as the split EQ bands are being controlled. And as we reduce the amount of frequency content, as we increase that high pass filter and the material becomes thinner, the wet reverb amount increases compared to the dry. Obviously, dry brings sounds to the front of the mix, wet pushes them towards the back. So you've got 2 things going on here. You've got a move towards a higher part of the frequency range and a reduction of the low frequency content, especially in the transient. So it's already going to sound as if it's receding, but to increase that illusion, we've also got this reverb, the wet amount increasing compared to the dry. And finally, again, the LFO is controlling the amount of mid-side information, and it is when it's basically full frequency content, and also the reverb is at its lowest, so the sound is right in front of you. It moves towards the middle of the left and right range, and then as it reduces the frequency content and things get more pushed back in the mix, then it moves from the middle and we widen the stereo image and it pushes everything towards the sides. And when you have all of those together, it sounds like this. Coming right into the front, very dry sound. And then it's moving up the pyramid sides, widening out and also receding due to the EQ and the reverb. And we have a little bit of left and right movement from the auto pan as well. So there we are, we have 3D motion in stereo, all three of the dimensions being treated holistically. And as I said, this is a technique just for moving a mono sound around. So imagine what you can do once you start adding other elements. Perhaps you can keep those more static and just keep one really interesting sound moving around your stereo image. It really is a lot of fun to experiment mixing in 3D. It's not just all about panning left and right, and it's not just all about positioning your sounds and leaving them there. You can move them around with all these plugins. So that's a very brief look and just one example of how I set up a effects rack in Ableton to move things around a 3D space. Thanks for watching. This is Kirk Degiorgio for Sonic Academy.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate the support from you guys. If you liked this video, then smash that like button, and if you want to be notified about new content, hit the subscribe and the bell notifications. Peace!